Hi, I'm Steve Sherman. As it happens, just a couple weeks ago, Peter and I got together and we filmed the entire standard video that talks about pyro processing and my minimal agitation process and the theories that I subscribe to behind that technique. As it happened, that particular weekend, just a couple days after Peter and I were together, a gentleman comes in for a split contrast printing workshop. So we got to a couple of negatives he was pretty excited about, and he tells me these were roll film negatives. He tells me he's excited about the negatives because they were processed in a technique he calls stand processing, stand development. So I said, gee, that's interesting. I said, where did you hear about this? He said, I saw some videos on the internet. I said, oh. I said, I want to be clear to the people in this video that you're going to see my process immediately after this. I want to be clear that my highlight densities are targeted for a very specific number. I want my highlights to be 0.9 to 1.0 above film base plus fog. Now, that dictates that every different highlight that I encounter, I have to record and I have to give a very specific development to it. That's how my process is based on predictable highlight densities at the end of the process when it goes to the silver printing part of things. The stand development videos that are out there, they make some blanket statements that all the highlight densities will just magically kind of fall in place. That's not the case with my process, and I hope that the folks that I'm speaking with in this video would be more exacting than that anyway. Nevertheless, because of this gentleman, I just felt the need to preface the video that you're going to see immediately following this.
Steve, hello. Thank you for getting together with us again. So, Steve, tonight we're going to talk about pyrochemistry and your minimal agitation process for your negative. So, share with us what you can, please.
I came to the Pyro family of developers back in the late 90s. Back then, Gordon Hutchings and the PMK formula, that was the accepted standard. So I tried it. And I immediately saw a benefit. It paid dividends in the highlights. My negatives were much easier to print. So naturally, I fell in love with the Pyro. Mm-hmm. So because of that, I continued to read and research as much as I possibly could. And along around 2000, 2001, I began to read a lot about Sandy King was formulating a new developer that he was designing, and it was he had called it PyroCat. And the reason he calls it PyroCat is PMK and Rollo and ABC pyros, they're formulated with a pyrogallol acid, whereas Sandy King's PyroCat is formulated with pyrocatechene developing agent. And come to find out, the pyrocatechene developing agent is a much more stable agent. It operates in a higher pH, so it's not as it's acidic. So it's more stable, it's more repeatable. So nevertheless, I tried the PyroCat, and I immediately saw not only did it pay dividends in the highlights like the PMK did, but I also liked the way it separated the mid-tone contrast. And if you know anything about my whole process, it's all about mid-tone contrast. All 5 segments of my process, every single one of them is targeted at creating greater mid-tone contrast. So it was very easy transition to go from PMK to PyroCat.
And when you say more mid-tone contrast, you're talking like more shades of gray before, like in the middle? Is that what you're saying?
More separation.
More separation.
More separation. If you're familiar with the H&D curve where there's a toe and there's a straight line to the film and then there's a shoulder as to how these densities react in relationships to exposure, essentially the straight line is steeper with PyroCat than it is with PMK, at least in my findings. And now that I'm talking back in 2000, 2001, now in 2015 and 16, where I'm teaching a lot of people, I've kind of charged myself with actually trying to get the same effect with PMK. So I have a much greater knowledge base now, and I can easily say that PyroCat creates a greater mid-tone contrast than PMK does.
Wow. Steve, you shared with us why you switched to PyroCam. I think it's fantastic, and especially with different photographers, if there's a benefit to them in just actually trying a different developer. You've talked about semi-stand and your minimal agitation process. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that came about as a result of doing a lot of reading. Back around 2002, in that time frame, I came across an article on unblinkingeye.com, which is an internet magazine that posts various different articles by well-known photographers. Sandy King had an article on there, and I believe the title of the article was what do staining developers have in common? So he wasn't only speaking about his own PyroCat developer, he was speaking about Pyro developers in general. Mm-hmm. Well, towards the end of the article, he just made a blanket statement, had nothing to do with PyroCat. He just had a statement about a process known as stand or semi-stand development. And I can still remember the quote. He said that while the process is fraught with dangers because of uneven development and other things, unexplained things that could happen, when it did work, extraordinary results were possible. Mm-hmm. So whether I accepted the challenge, it got my interest, and I wanted to see if I could effectively tame this process.
Nice. With is there like an example of what of an image of a semi-stand image that you can share with us, or?
There is, and it's actually the image that's right behind me is actually essentially the first very successful image that I was able to achieve with that process. That's a semi-stand process negative behind me. As I recall, I believe it's a 45-minute processing time with just one agitation for 30 seconds in the middle.
45 minutes?
45 minutes in chemistry.
Wow. And with developing a negative for that long, what were some of the benefits? Why develop it that long, Steve?
Well, you know what? Rather than talk about it, let me take you down to the darkroom and I'll show you a couple of negatives on a light table, and you're going to see just how dramatic and dynamic the process can be when it's done correctly.
Wow. That's cool. Thank you. Yes, let's go to the look.
Well, as I say, I read the Sandy King articles and I set about to see if I could perfect the process. And the first few negatives that came out, they had some success. I continued to monkey around with dilutions and agitation schemes. And then one day, this particular negative came out from an actual scene that I shot in Arizona. Two identically exposed negatives. You can see the top one has been minimally agitated. The bottom one here has been tray processed in Pyro. The bottom negative has a measured density, highlight density of 1.79. That's quite a bit higher than silver would demand, but nevertheless it would be in line for a platinum palladium alternative process density. Whereas the top negative, its highlight density only measures 1.33. You can see my numbers here on the edge of the film rebate. Traditional wisdom would tell you that the negative that has the higher density is going to be a more contrasty negative. Obviously, that is not the case with the minimally agitated negative. The one that only has a 1.33 density shows considerably more micro contrast and mid-tone contrast, and that's immediately what struck me. And, you know, I have a couple of good friends that I showed this particular negative to, and they were just dumbfounded. They had never seen anything like it, nor had I seen anything like it until this particular process.
Steve, follow-up question. With the two different identical images, both shot the same, but processed differently, what are the benefits that you found?
The benefits, as far as I'm concerned, my process, there's 5 components of my process, and every single one of those components, the key element, I am targeting mid-tone contrast. In my mind, photographers that shoot the type of work that I do are constantly looking for mid-tone contrast. How can they increase mid-tone contrast? And my whole process is based on affecting a higher mid-tone contrast. So the benefit would be to any photographer using sheet film or film in general. you're very basically, the bottom end of is governed by exposure. The top end is governed by film development. What happens in between until this process was pretty much out of your hands. So you were held to whatever the contrast relationships were in the original literal scene. Now, with the minimal agitation type of development, all of these midtones are exaggerated, greatly exaggerated, and they can be controlled in the printing process much easier. It's always much easier to diminish midtone contrast than it is to increase it. Much easier. So in that sense, it's a tremendous attribute and technique to add to a film photographer's toolbox, so to speak.
Nice. Steve, can any photographer or any artist use this technique to fit their own aesthetic pleasing of their artwork or their fine art that they're looking for?
Sure, I think so, because as I just said, to lessen midtone contrast is very easy. To increase it is a much different story, and we'll deal more with that in the printing process, where you'll actually see me split print with different contrast lights, and how my process relies on a minimum amount of the green soft contrast light. I actually call it contrast killing green light, because that's what it does. It kills mid-tone contrast. The more green light you have to use, because your highlights are so dense, the more your mid-tone contrast will suffer. And that's why my negatives are it's a different design negative than it was 10 or 15 years ago. I develop a negative to a very low density so that I can expand the contrast in the printing paper with the multi-contrast printing paper that are available nowadays.
Steve, thank you. I got a couple more questions. Thank you for showing us those negs, but I got a couple more questions. Steve, thank you so much for showing us the differences in the negatives. I mean, that really kind of cemented the difference of your process.
It's dramatic.
So, yes. Steve, why have you so freely shared your discovery and refinements of the semi-stand process with others? Why do you want to share this information?
That's a good question, Peter. First of all, I'm not a businessman. I'm a photographer. So when I first made this discovery, I knew that it was substantial. I knew it was significant. Did I know it would become a worldwide phenomenon? No, I didn't. But at the same time, I'm a photographer. I want to share my knowledge. Now, at this point in my time, in my career, I want to share my process. I'm going to give away a lot of information, but let's be honest that there's the opportunity for me to sell the knowledge that I have, because I don't think there are very many people that have a process like mine that's all inclusive, from light all the way through the final process of actually split toning a print. So there's so many incremental steps that make up my process. For me to share this information, it's not going to set the world on fire for the next photographer down the road, unless he combines everything that I'm doing. Then he's going to see a significant change.
You know, you shared with us an image that you took out in Arizona, and you showed the straight print at 2.5, and then you showed a completed image using your process,
right,
and lighting techniques in your process. I mean, that was dramatic, and I'll insert those images, or at least reference it in this interview. But that was profound. What is possible with old negatives that anybody, again, 10, 15 years ago, you thought those negatives are, you couldn't print them, but now you can. Share us your thoughts.
That's another good question. And I think it goes back to my whole process. I'm very good friends with a printer in Toronto, but name is Bob Carney. Bob has had me up there to do workshops for him. I happen to think Bob is one of the 5 best printers in the world. Yet, the prints that he makes for his clients don't have the mid-tone contrast that mine have. And that's a result of the way my negatives are processed. And, the whole process in concert with one another from beginning to end pays dividends in the form of mid-tone contrast. That's why there's 5 components to my process. And that's why I believe strongly that each component has a valid value.
Excellent. Steve, can you share with us, in a very easy to understand or a layman's way in understandable terms of what happens and why it's so powerful?
I can, and I hope this resonates with people that are going to see this video, because I've, more so than I think than most instructors, I've poured over the words that I've used. I've stopped students mid-lecture, and when they've asked me a question and they've used a word that I was surprised that they used, I've stopped them and I've written that word down so that I can adapt my explanation because of the questions that are coming back to me. But in my mind, the way to describe what's happening here is dilution. More dilute developer allows a longer time for the negative to be in chemistry. That longer time allows less frequent agitation, which is paramount to the process. Less frequent agitation allows the developer to exhaust. That's the key. And I don't hear a lot of people talking about developer actually exhausting. When the developer exhausts, that's what allows for adjacency effects to happen. Adjacency effects are what you see when the microcontrast is so exaggerated. Edward Weston used to have a term that he called the Mackey line. I have virtually never heard that term in modern times. But that's essentially what it is. A Mackey line is a little fine, minute line that would go around the areas of dissimilar tonalities in the older, thick emulsion films where it was easier to exaggerate those types of things. With today's thin, modern emulsion, very thin emulsion films, it's not so easy. That's why this process is so beneficial. What this minimal agitation does, it's essentially, in one short phrase, it's organic, unsharp masking.
Okay.
It's done organically, done chemically. Now, it can't be reversed. You can't lessen it or increase it, but it's done organically. And I've had people look at the prints and say there's a smoothness, yet there's a startling, striking mid-tone contrast to it, yet it's still smooth. And I believe that's because of the organic nature of the way it happens.
So with your process and exhausting the chemistry, meaning you're diluting the chemistry to the point where there's not enough left in it to actually keep developing the negative. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
So it's like a watered down dilution, basically.
That's correct.
And then what happens there is that adjacency effect, which is just like the edges of contrast just build more. Is that a way of saying it?
I believe there's a part of the emulsion that actually doesn't process, and it leaves this microscopic thin line that outlines all these dissimilar tonalities.
So, Steve, with all this dilutions and adjacency effect, I mean, I know you touched on it with showing us the negative earlier, but what's the benefit to the photographer or the artist for this effect?
Well, I think there's several benefits. Number one, your prints will look much different than most other people's because of the mid-tone contrast, and it's important to continue to highlight the fact that it's done organically, so it's believable. The way my negatives are designed, with a lot of bottom end exposure, but very, very minimal very minimal density on the high end, allows me to expand contrast during the printing process. And when you don't have to use as much green light, you can use more blue light. Blue light increases mid-tone contrast. It's a very simple equation. The more green light you must use, the more zero filtration you must use, the mid-tone contrast suffer. Of course, you bring in your highlights and you put gray tone in the highlights, but if your negatives are so dense that you need to use a lot of green, a lot of soft contrast, well, that soft contrast also goes down into the midtones. Whereas the number 5 filtration, or the blue filtration, the first thing that it impacts are the dark values. So it's going right by the highlights, and the first thing it's impacting is the dark values. So you can see where the mid-tone contrast builds if you're allowed to use more if you're allowed to use more blue light than green light. It's a simple equation as to my negative design.
Steve, you've certainly shared a lot of information, a lot of value with your photographic process. What's a photographer going to expect with your premium video?
In the premium video, not only will you get this explanation in the standard video, you will go on location with me. We will expose film to a very low contrast situation, and we'll expose film to a very high contrast situation. We will come back to the darkroom. We will process the film. I will show you step by step in the tubes that I use, how and why I designed the tubes that I have. You'll see the dilution that I use. You'll see the agitation technique that I use. You're going to see everything that I do to affect a minimally agitated negative. All the way down to reading densitometer readings, just everything that you will need to do the process yourself.
That sounds fantastic, Steve. Thank you very much for sharing all your information and your knowledge. And again, your work speaks for itself. Thank you very much. We look forward to talking to you again very, very soon. And I'm looking forward to the premium videos.
Thank you.
Thanks.